Welcome back to Chapter 4 of the Saints of Snowville. Let's get started. What in the hell to do with Jared Perry had been on the bishop's mind for several months. It was hard to call a man in and tell him that he was too damned religious. Next to a little friendly adultery, a religious fanatic raises more hell than anything else. Counselor Ezra Hunter opened to the father of the ward. "That silly bastard keeps the whole ward upset," continued the bishop. "What with his revelations, prophecies, and pronouncement of the mysteries." Last Sunday the bishop had attended the gospel doctrine class to see what the hell Pretty Perry was telling his class. Jared had been nicknamed Pretty by Royce Schaefer many years before because he's such an ugly bastard. The bishop was amused by the short colloquy between Brother Perry and Asa Jensen, a class member. Near the beginning of the lesson, the terms food and raiment were used. Brother Jensen held up his hand to ask what the difference was between them. The teacher first asked if anyone in the class could explain. No one volunteered. Brother Perry then said, "Well, we all know what is meant by food. That's meat, taters, and gravy, and stuff like that. Raiment is dessert, like cake, pie, and ice cream." No one disputed this learned explanation, and everyone seemed to be satisfied. The assigned lesson was on the Jaredites of the Book of Mormon, but Brother Perry had roamed far afield. He promised that those who were married in the temple would be gods and goddesses, and would people a planet not unlike the earth. He further stated that the Holy Ghost was female, and that we have a mother in heaven, the same as a father. This latter doctrine was not original with Perry, but had been started by Eliza R. Snow more than 50 years before. Eliza R. was a homely old maid with a willful person. She was insanely envious that women, along with Negroes, could not hold the priesthood. She conceived the idea that women had some part in the creative process and deduced that God had a wife who was mortal man's mother in heaven. This doctrine, though it had no scriptural basis and had never been thought of by the general authorities, seemed harmless at the time, and in order to placate Miss Snow and Miss Smith, Miss Young, or whatever the hell her name was, her contemporaries never disputed the theory. Eliza R. was married to 2 prophets after her childbearing years had passed. Although she probably never cohabitated with anyone, she was also the sister of another prophet, and therefore became a power behind the throne of the church government. The next generation hesitated to take issue with her theory. They reasoned that it was false doctrine. Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball should have set her straight. Their silence was construed by some of the approval. Now, for the first time, people in the church were saying without equivocation that God was married and we had a mother in heaven. "We have made fun of the Catholics," Fred Calvert, the bishop's first counselor, said, "for changing the doctrine of the church. But God only knows what the Mormons will be teaching after 1900 years. "A mistake most Mormons make," said the bishop, "is assuming that whenever God's anointed open their mouths, they have just received a fresh revelation. In fact, I have thought about this matter at considerable length, and am convinced that the prophets in Salt Lake City are very much human and subject to error in many things. We have got to remember that these men in Salt Lake City are mortals, and they say and do damn fool things that have nothing to do with the gospel. They put their pants on in the morning the same way you and I do. You recall in the fall of 1920, President Grant said he favored Harding in the presidential election. Some Mormons said he had had a revelation. In Evanston, Wyoming, it was said in church that God appeared to President Grant and told him to vote for Harding. President Grant never at any time suggested any inspiration in his political preference. Some wild-eyed pulpit pounders like Jared Perry were now calling the manifesto a revelation. When it was announced in 1890 by Wilfred Woodruff, he specifically said that he had received no direction from God in this matter, and each man was free to follow his own conscience. Several things that Joseph Smith did were simply errors in judgment. We would be better off to admit the errors and excuse them as a result of human frailties rather than try to justify the mistakes. For example, the bishop continued, as he warmed up to his subject, it was treason plain and simple for Joseph Smith to organize the Nauvoo Legion and appoint himself a lieutenant general. He got himself a uniform with gold braid and carried a warlike saber. No wonder the people in Illinois mobbed the Saints. The largest army military force in Illinois was enough to strike terror in the hearts of the Gentiles. Joseph Smith must have been a rather pompous spectacle, parading around as a self-appointed lieutenant general in defiance of the law of the land. Joseph Smith aspiring to be presidency of the United States in 1844 was an error in judgment, said the bishop, now getting really vocal. Every presidential election year, there is in one or more of these lunatic fringe that run for president, said Frank Calvert. These people usually have a superego, which manifests itself in running for office or some other damn fool thing to gain public attention. The human frailties of Joseph Smith have nothing to do with the truthfulness of the gospel, the bishop reminded his brethren, but only demonstrate what he himself told the people, that is, he had weaknesses and needed greater strength than our own. The prophet Joseph had a weakness for good-looking women, as did other prophets before and since. His affinity for Emma Hale was not understood by his older and more opinious brethren. He was sensual, possessive, and unstable, but Joseph was blinded to the numerous defects and saw only her beauty. When some of the other wiser heads in the church questioned Emma's suitability to be the wife of the prophet, Joseph cut them off short by saying that he would go through hell to have Emma. Joseph tried to rehabilitate Emma in the eyes of his brethren by giving her positions far beyond her capabilities, including the presidency of the Ladies' Relief Society. Emma was weak in the faith and probably would never have been a church member except that she was the wife of the prophet. After the prophet was murdered in 1844, Emma and her equally weak children left the church and never returned. Thus the original opinion of Joseph's contemporaries regarding Emma was vindicated. This business about a female god and its ramifications, continued the bishop, has been discussed in church for more than 50 years. It was a matter of speculation, but had never been announced by the brethren in the Salt Lake City. The theory lent itself a ridiculous ramifications in the minds of people like Pretty Perry. According to the disciples of Eliza R. Snow, the spiritual creation was a cooperative effort between her father in heaven and the mother in heaven, and both sexes were absolutely essential in the creative process. If this be true, said the bishop, how in the hell did they come up with the animals, birds, insects, and fish, as well as human beings? Most Mormons believe that the animals and other living creatures have a spirit and were first created spiritually, the same as man. How a male god and a female god could produce offspring that sometimes were human and other times animals presents an imponderable dilemma. I suppose, interrupted Ezra Hunter, that if animals, birds, and insects all have spirits, they will be resurrected the same as people. As that thought sunk in, he continued, My lord, why would anyone want to see them goddamned mosquitoes and gophers resurrected? Neither the bishop nor Fred Calvert could explain that. When I contemplate this idiotic theory, I think of what J. Golden Kimball told me when I went on a mission. The bishop laughed. Kimball said that the greatest testimony to him that the gospel was true was the fact that the ignorant missionaries hadn't killed it years ago by the damned fooled things they preached. If this be true of the missionaries, it is doubly true of some of the illiterates that are in the wards and stakes who fancy that someday they will be gods and people earths. I think that they are going to find out that there are qualifications other than a lifetime of living the word of wisdom before we become gods and have spiritual offspring. Enough of this philosophy, said the bishop good-naturedly, as he collected some papers on his desk. We have got to do something with Brother Perry before he recruits some of the brethren to be gods on their other planets. The happiest solution, opinioned Counselor Calvert, would be to send him on another mission, if the ward could offer to support his family. Hell, the burden would be greatly increased, the bishop reminded his counselors. Since he went through his wife's inheritance, he has practically lived off the ward's fast offerings. Stella would sure as hell appreciate it if we could do something to keep Jared out of her bed for a few years. Counselor Hunter added. She's been pregnant 3/4 of the time they have been married. Pretty came home from a mission with multiplying and replenishing the earth on his mind, and he sure as hell has worked at it, Jackson said. She doesn't object as much as you might think, Counselor, Calvert reminded his brethren. Many is the time when Jared came home from Ogden in the afternoon, and she hustled the kids over to Hahn's place and then jumped in bed. They fight like hell, the bishop laughed, but make up in bed, he continued. Lyle Spencer told me that the morning he started to get in the milk cans off the porch to take to the creamery, he heard the damnedest racket inside the house. Pretty was raising his voice, and Stella was screaming. Jared said, "Don't call me a liar, Stella Perry, or I'll knock you through the glass door." About that time, Lyle turned around to retreat to his milk wagon. Jared opened the door and said, "Just a minute, Brother Spencer. We were just having a family prayers." As near as Lyle can determine, that night in bed, they contracted for their 6th child. "Seriously," said the bishop, "it's just wishful thinking to talk about sending him on another mission." "Let's kick him upstairs," said Calvert. "That's a possibility," mused Jackson. "Where can we put him so he won't do any damage?" "Maybe President Benson will put him on the High Council," added Counselor Hunter. "That will solve our problem," said the bishop. "Benson does all the work himself anyway, and only uses the High Council once a month to preach in the words. E. Nephi Benson likes to pack the High Council with pious-appearing men who are not too bright," he mused. "These saints follow blindly the edicts of announced at the stake headquarters. We would only get him once a year, and I guess we can stand that as High Councilman. Jared would spend a lot of time traveling and presiding, but not as much time talking, at least not in any one place. Well, I'll peddle him to the stake if Benson will have him," concluded the Judge Israel.